Good morning, everybody. My name is Ellen Hannick, and I'm Vice President at the Public Policy Institute of California, and I'm the Director of the PPIC Water Policy Center. Sorry for the little technical glitch with the live stream, but we're glad to be able to bring you this first session of our conference by recording. Today's session is Making Our Water Infrastructure Climate Ready, and this is the first session of our 3-day virtual conference, which is on the theme Seizing the Drought, Water Priorities for Our Changing Climate. And as you all know, California is in the midst of another severe record-breaking warm drought, and this is coming quickly on the heels of the last record-breaking warm drought of 2012 through 16, so not that long ago. And we're experiencing head-on at this point many of the things that the climate models have been predicting: hotter temperatures, more extreme precipitation. We just had the single wettest day on record in Northern California at the beginning of this rainy season, diminishing snowpack and snow droughts, drier soils, changing runoff, and with significant consequences of all of these things for the human environment and for our natural environment, both our freshwater ecosystems and our terrestrial ecosystems and our forests. Droughts are always learning opportunities and a chance for us to improve and get better at adapting. And this conference is built around the idea that this is a moment to seize, to move from planning to action, to tackle climate change's highly disruptive effects on our water system. And so to do that, we're bringing together an amazing group of experts over the course of 3 days to discuss how to meet this challenge, build resilience, do it in an equitable manner for the benefit of all of California's communities, our economy, and our natural environment. So before we get going, I would like to just offer a big word of thanks to our diverse group of sponsors for making today's event possible. These organizations are listed on your screen and also on our website. Our annual sponsors of the Water Policy Center bring together a broad cross-section of organizations engaged in California water. This diverse coalition of funders supports activities that expand our audience, our credibility, and our influence as a trusted and objective source of information on water policy in California. And so we'd like to invite you to please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor if you're not one already, so that we can continue to make programs like today's possible and ensure that they are free and open to the public. You can learn more about us and how to support us at ppic.org. Also wanted to give you a reminder that PPIC is a public charity. We do not support or take positions on any ballot measure or legislation, and we do not support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. And normally we have time set aside at the end of the program for audience Q&A, but since we're not able to live broadcast, we're just going to leave a little bit more time for our awesome moderator to ask questions of our panel. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce him. It's my dear colleague, Alvar Escriva-Bou, who is a senior fellow with the PPIC Water Policy Center, and he will moderate today's panel and introduce you to them.
Thanks, Ellen, so much for the introduction. And now, welcome to our first panel, Making Our Water Infrastructure Climate Ready. We have 4 experts to talk about climate change and infrastructure. But before I introduce them, I would like to say a few words to focus the discussion. One question that keeps coming to my mind is climate change outpacing us? Sometimes it looks like we are not ready for the more frequent and intense drought and flood events that we are seeing. In this new climate reality, we are facing 2 major challenges. The first is aging infrastructure. 2/3 of California's dams are at least 50-year-old. And we have similar problems with our conveyance infrastructure and also with our levees. The second major challenge is how to adapt our management, our real-time operations, to weather these extremes. So I'm hoping to cover these issues in our conversation. Then there are other 2 cross-cutting points worth mentioning before we start. We have to keep in mind that infrastructure means not just surface reservoirs, conveyance, and levees, but also our natural green infrastructure, such as aquifers and floodplains. And then, as we discuss about climate adaptation, I would like to encourage our experts to discuss also equity considerations. And now, without further ado, let me introduce the panelists. We have first Ali Forsythe, the Environmental Planning and Permitting Manager with the Sites Project Authority. Thanks for joining us, Ali. We have Karla Nemeth, the Director of the California Department of Water Resources. Thanks, Karla, for taking the time. Then Tim Ramirez, a board member with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. Thanks, Tim. And finally, Daniel Swain, a climate scientist with the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. So thank you all for being with us. With that, I will go with the first set of questions. What I would like to know, how are we doing? Are we doing enough to adapt our water infrastructure? So let me start with Daniel. So the chances of more severe droughts and floods are increasing, but sometimes it looks like we haven't yet changed our water management practices. Are we taking too many risks? What's your message for policymakers on how to adapt to this new reality?
Well, we know that the vast majority of the water infrastructure in California and really in most places in the West was designed and developed in the 20th century, in some cases in the first half of the 20th century. And the climate then was significantly different than it is today. And the climate of a couple decades from now is going to be significantly different, even more so than it was from the early 20th century when most of this infrastructure was developed. So, our climate today obviously is warmer than it was in the early 20th century. But not only are those rising temperatures having a number of direct impacts, but they're also producing a situation where the same amount of water doesn't go as far. And I'm not talking about consumptive use. I'm literally just talking about the physical water balance. A certain amount of water falls from the sky as rain and snow and precipitation, and a certain amount of it, either evaporates again or goes somewhere else, and that balance is shifting as temperatures rise. And so, our expectation about what climate change is doing to the future of California's hydroclimate is nuanced. It's not only a question of increasing drought severity due to rising temperatures. It's also a question of shifting precipitation seasonality with shorter but sharper rainy seasons and less water in the shoulder seasons. It's a question of increasing precipitation whiplash, so seeing wetter wets, but also drier dries. And so managing that increased variability along with that mean warming, it presents a pretty complicated picture and suggests that the conditions that we're observing outside the window today are significantly different than those which were in place when we designed California's water systems.
Thanks so much, Daniel. That was super interesting. Karla, that's what science is telling us, but unfortunately, we are living through these extremes in real life, right? Whether it's the last drought or the current drought. What are we learning about how water management needs to change? What are the lessons?
So there's a lot of them. I think I'll start maybe with your question, which is, are we ready? And so I think the answer to that is not yet. And for me, one of the primary examples of that is for the State Water Project. As you all know, Oroville is the primary reservoir for the State Water Project. And in fact, in 2020, DWR made the policy decision to carry over more water than we had been previously. That's one of the things we learned about the previous drought was we needed to plan for more successive dry years. So in 2020, we increased carryover storage by about 300,000 acre feet. That's 20% of the reservoir's capacity, or by 20% rather. And what we saw in 2021 is, we got pretty smoked. We had a lot of carryover, or we thought we were doing better with carryover. And then what we started experiencing on the ground, really in April and May, was this very rapid snowmelt from high ambient temperatures, but also snowmelt that wasn't making it into the rivers and streams. So typically we have about 60%-ish. We call that runoff efficiency. This past year we had 20-ish%. And that really is just a massive acceleration in terms of what we had been planning for. And so what we learned was that sort of late in the season, even though we have some snowpack, that that can change late in the season. So how well we do pre-planning is going to be crucial. And then I want to make two other points around how we're starting to manage through that. One is, we ended this year with historic low rainfall, or a historic low reservoir, rather. And one of the things that contributed to that was pretty high depletions in the system, meaning both Shasta, Oroville, and Folsom, we were releasing water to maintain a degree of salinity control in the Delta. We had put in drought barriers, which is something familiar in terms of our drought management strategy. We did something new with New Melones in California that we've never done before. But one of the things that was also driving that was depletions in the system, meaning water we were releasing from the reservoirs wasn't making it down into the Delta and out to the Golden Gate. Some of that was because of unmeasured or illegal diversions, but some of it was actually a lack of accretion back into the system that we typically see over the summer. So that was also depressed, and all of that was to the tune of 250,000 acre feet of water, which becomes real water when we have these intense droughts. So that's kind of one managing point we need to be thinking about. But the second thing is, as we see ambient temperatures rise, we also have to account for different kinds of human behavior in response to that. So a lot of planting started early this past year because temperatures were high. And so there was an opportunity to get crops in the ground sooner. You take them out later. But generally, we also saw diversion decisions happening earlier in the year. And I think it's going to be similar. Right now, I'm down in LA. It's going to be 84 degrees in Burbank. They're coming off of record high temperatures this past week. So we're also going to see human behaviors change in response to these climate patterns. And all of that very much affects how we manage through the system with the infrastructure that we have in place right now.
Thanks, Karla. And that brings a perfect segue to the question that I had for Ali. Is that my colleague Jeff Mount and many others keep telling me that we're failing to manage water for the environment. For example, there are recent reports about huge salmon mortality on the Sacramento River this summer. So Ali, drawing on your restoration background, how can infrastructure help us balance environmental needs with water supplies for cities and farms?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I think, as Daniel talked to us and as Karla indicated, we see a more variable future. We see a more diverse future in runoff, wetter, wets, drier, dry times. We need to be thinking about what we do about the environment for that. There is no silver bullet solution to drought and managing through drought in the future. It's really that diverse portfolio, kind of analogous to a lot of what our water districts do. They have a real diverse portfolio and how they manage through droughts. A number of them do, especially Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, having quite a diverse portfolio and being able to navigate this pretty well these past couple of years. But we don't have that portfolio for the environment. We really kind of have a regulatory portfolio. We don't have a asset portfolio. So we really see the opportunity through the WISP program, through the WIN Act, the federal WIN Act, and through really the new federal infrastructure bill to create a diverse portfolio for the environment, for our agricultural and M&I partners, but also for the environment. At sites, we're really envisioning giving the environment the same rights and abilities to flexibly manage their storage in the reservoir. So being able to have, say, an ecosystem water manager that would decide how to utilize the storage in sites that's dedicated to the environment and how to utilize that water call on it at different times, make different decisions in different years, depending on those real-time conditions. And we see that as something really that sites can start to be a part of, but it needs to be bigger and broader than that. Sites is not going to be the silver bullet solution fix for the environment for future droughts. But we need to develop that overall portfolio that gives a number of assets for folks to pull on when we get into these drought situations in the future.
Thanks, Ali. That's really, really interesting to think about the portfolio of solutions also for the environment. So team, we are in drought times. Sometimes we forget that we also have floods, right? This time. So we know that flood risks are increasing alarmingly. So how are we doing on adapting to these risks? Are we doing enough? So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for trying to reflect all the spectrum of the hydrologic cycle and cover the flood side as well. I'm going to echo Karla's comment. There's room for improvement. We are not ready. It's been almost 25 years since the 1997 flood, and it's been almost 10 years since the board adopted the first Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. And it feels like in a lot of ways, the priorities that were illustrated then and came to light 25 years ago are still the priorities. We have made some improvements. We're making some investments. There were some things that changed in the legislation in 2007 and 8 that required urban areas in particular to be prepared and develop plans for 200-year level of protection. And those things are happening and those investments are being made. But as Daniel said also, we're designing things now based on old standards in a different regime. And we're not ready for the new cycle that's coming. And that was illustrated 25 years ago. And we've done a lot of things since then. We've made some investments, and it's a foundation to build on. But from the system perspective, when you look up at the reservoirs in the Sierra, especially on the San Joaquin side, it's hard to say that we're ready for what we know is going to come and what's happened already in our recent past.
Yeah, we had also a good example in 2017, right? So let's move now to the kind of second set of questions where I would like to talk a little bit about what should we improve. So getting back to Daniel and following up on floods. So we've done a lot of thinking about floods, right? So, but beyond long-term projections, science could help better manage our water infrastructure for droughts and floods too, right? What new tools are available?
Well, I think one of the interesting things, and why I'm glad we're talking about floods in a conversation about droughts, is that they are two sides of the same hydrologic coin. And California is a place that in particular might see a pretty significant increase in both of these things with climate change, arguably already is, especially on the drought side, but we shouldn't lose sight of the flood side because, in part, not only does that complicate management considerations, because obviously in any given moment, drought and flood objectives or mitigation objectives are at least superficially posed against each other. There are some cases where that isn't actually the case. And I think a lot of this comes around when we talk about natural infrastructure and the idea that you can both reduce the risk of really big flood events and also mitigate the consequences of really severe droughts by being more flexible with water. And in a lot of cases, this may not necessarily mean large above ground reservoirs. This might essentially involve thinking more critically about managing groundwater and the aquifers that we already have and finding ways to take advantage, if you will, of these relatively brief and infrequent, but increasingly extreme periods of very wet conditions when there is some risk to populated areas from flood, and then taking that water where and when it's available and doing some constructive things with it to recharge groundwater. So this is generally the groundwater recharge is called MAR, the Managed Aquifer Recharge. There's also something that's increasingly become referred to as flood MAR. So specifically using excess flows, these potentially damaging flows when and where they occur, to do that recharge. So taking this water that you actually don't want in that moment and putting it somewhere where you actually will want it in the future. And in the meantime, take the pressure off the levees in a place like Sacramento or somewhere in the San Joaquin Valley, for example. So there's a lot of conversations about how to use this sort of natural infrastructure to in a controlled way, if you will, let rivers do their thing, and in doing so, help to simultaneously reduce the risk of flood and then bank some water to mitigate the risk of future droughts. Now, obviously, that's much easier said than done, and I'm a physical scientist, so I get to live sometimes in the ideal world. But that is sort of an intervention that is commensurate with what the physical science says will happen, and sort of the observations we've already seen. Again, as was already mentioned, we're both in the middle of a historically severe and hot drought, and also just experienced the wettest days on record in some parts of Northern California, all within the past 30 days. So this is sort of a preview of what we think the future will continue to look like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was thinking, we need a lot of imagination to putting these things into practice. And Karla, we know that the state has been leading many efforts, including the climate resilience portfolio, the flood work that Daniel just mentioned, or the analysis of conveyance infrastructure, just to name a few. So what exciting opportunities do you see for better managing our water infrastructure? And where do we need additional infrastructure investments?
Yeah, so one, I think foundationally we need better information, and we need better information like right now. And so as we can see last year, our forecasts really didn't hold up. And so DWR is really redoubling efforts to improve our ability for forecasting. We've got some intense work underway in the Sacramento Valley, but we're also very active with Scripps Institute and other partners on how do we improve seasonal forecasting, and how do we share that information more broadly. One, through our planning processes. So one of the things actually that is pretty interesting going on at the department is getting better alignment between the California Water Plan and the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan. So those are plans that are mandated to occur every 5 years, but they don't occur together. And so one of the things we need to do is start making those connections so that when we're thinking about flood, we're also managing for drought. And when we're thinking about drought, we're also managing for flood. But the underpinning of all of that, needs to be data sets that are starting to really improve on our forecasting capabilities, embracing a broader range of uncertainty, which I think is scary, frankly, because, the wider you get with the possible scenarios, the more expensive it feels like to do anything, right? And so, but we have to get that information on the table in all these various planning processes through which the state supports local water districts or flood control agencies, and even for that matter, our sustainable groundwater agencies, working off the same set of information, if you will, so that we can do a better job prioritizing investments that can actually integrate. So at the department, we're looking at things in our flood realm. We call it headwaters to floodplain. So it's watershed wide. So we're looking at that in the flood planning realm, but we also have to connect that to the water supply planning realm. A couple of things that we need infrastructure wise, of course, as folks know, the department is a big supporter of Delta conveyance and getting some improvements there. Really improvements designed to protect that water supply from extreme flood events, but also opportunistically divert that water when we have a big booming year, when we'll have less conflict between fish and water supply needs. So we need to be doing those kinds of things, but we absolutely need to be taking advantage of underground storage. And so there's a lot of work underway. The California Water Commission is looking at, in particular, regional kinds of conveyance that can help make that connection. Again, all of that's going to work better if we have better information, better data around forecasting. A couple initiatives. One was in the governor's first drought emergency proclamation. He directed the department to develop a California drought monitor. So that's going to be really important for us to understand more across kind of a grid system than the 8-river index, which is important when we think about water supplies, but really to get to something that's more granular for California, that identifies the different kinds of microclimates, but also starts to identify available water supplies. The first version of the California Drought Monitor will be out by the end of this year. It will be a work in progress, but it's going to be an important new tool in communicating with the public around the role of drought in our lives. The second piece that I think is really important on the data and how do we put these things together front is we are going to release what's called Cal Groundwater Live, which is a monthly time step update of what's going on in our groundwater basins. So people can search by parcel, by all kinds of ways to see, is the groundwater level dropping? Is it rising? What's water quality doing? And we're going to start to see this, again, we all knew it was happening in the last drought because we knew there were so many domestic wells going dry. But we're going to start to have as much of a real time as a monthly time step can provide, and knowing that we don't have all the data, but we are going to have a live portal where we can be improving upon that to establish what's happening below the ground. That's really, I think, is also absolutely essential to helping us really weather through these dry periods. And that, to me, is such a fundamental improvement from where we were in the previous drought, our ability to really see what's happening with our groundwater levels. So in my mind, it would be great to have, we all look at all the reservoir levels. Some of our daily newspapers print it, which I love, but we're going to have similar information for a very significant water supply source for Californians, and that's water under the ground. And that's also going to help us demonstrate, I think, there's a lot of enthusiasm behind brick and mortar storage. And some of it, I think, is because people can see it and they know that it's there. But this will also provide, I think, a real boost for how we measure progress and how we work towards, through the managed aquifer recharge, focusing those investments and seeing those improvements in groundwater basins.
Thanks so much, Karla. This really looks exciting for all this new data, and also to understand the complexity of California's water system. It could help us a lot, I think. So, team, both Karla and Daniel talk about managing floods for droughts. So I was thinking, what combination of investments and management changes are needed in the Central Valley to address flood risks?
In a word, more floodplains. I think there's 4 things I would say. 1, rivers need to be bigger, particularly on the San Joaquin side. They were built a very long time ago. The map behind me is not a coincidence. It's a 1913 map of the San Joaquin Valley near Stockton. This is the same map that was used to generate the system that we built on the Sacramento side that includes bypasses. We don't have a system like that on the San Joaquin. It was really built to carry snowmelt in a controlled fashion down through the Delta. It was not built to have floods, and rivers need floods. The second thing I would say is that we need to have a different way to fund some of the important investments we need to make. Multi-benefit projects are sort of the catchphrase now, but those projects are being funded by multiple sources. We're putting the burden on the people that are doing the hard work to go and get 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different fund sources, grant opportunities to make one project happen. And we need to find a way to streamline that and to make those things more efficient. And the rules are also very old, like the infrastructure. If we have to follow the same rules that we've used the last 100 years to build these improvements, then we're trying to put a square peg into a round hole very often. We don't want to wait for these areas to be urbanized and then build levees, especially when we have space still. We want to take advantage of those opportunities and make cost-effective investments now to make more floodplains. And that's the last comment, just to go full circle on this. Karla mentioned it also about communication, especially among the state agencies. The board, our board, the flood board, when we met in person back in the day, it was the Sacramento City Hall, which is right across the street from the Cali PA building where the State Resources Control Board met, sometimes on the same day. And we had people going back and forth, the people in the valley, the stakeholders, the nonprofits, the water districts, talking to both of us. And very rarely, less often, we talked with each other. And I think the board is as excited, the flood board, as the state water board is about floodplains. Rivers need floods because the fish in rivers need floods. And having that space is really going to help minimize our risk of flooding.
Thanks, Tim. That's really interesting. So Ali, Tim mentioned the multi-benefit, multi-purpose projects, and you are on the team that's trying to build sites reservoir, which would benefit the environment as well as agriculture and urban users. So what does it take to build this kind of multi-benefit projects?
Oh, goodness. Large infrastructure takes time, as it should. Frankly, we should be very thoughtful and careful in thinking about the long-term implications of what we're building, because these projects are around for decades or centuries. So when we think about new infrastructure, be it sites reservoirs as an off-stream storage reservoir or floodplain inundation and moving adding more room to our rivers to allow them to move through and have some more inundation, we think about infrastructure that works collaboratively with our existing facilities. We really see the future is collaboration and partnership. Future is built on relationships. Really to share in the good times and share in the bad. At sites, we have over 23 member districts, in addition to the state and federal government. And that makes the project incredibly complicated. But to me, it also adds just unlimited potential to collaborate now and in the future, really in ways that we can't even imagine today. We really also see that our infrastructure needs to fill some of the gaps that we have. So we've all talked about these more intensive storms, infrastructure that allows us to store more flows during these intense events, get some water off of our rivers, have those flood benefits, but also be able to hold that water until we can release it later for the environment, for M&I users, for ag users. Really thinking about infrastructure that retains some of this water on our landscape longer. And there's great ways, like Tim is indicating, through floodplain management and increasing our floodplains and potentially our bypass systems, providing some groundwater recharge in that, but also providing really important floodplain benefits for our salmonids, for our wetland species, for our flyway, our Pacific flyway, and then those flood attenuation benefits. I look at it and I say these multi-benefit projects require us to move outside of our comfort zone and challenge ourselves to seek partnerships in ways that we never thought were possible before. And building these projects takes a lot of empathy, a lot of collaboration, a lot of partnerships, willingness to seek win-win solutions, trying to find a way to help everybody get a little bit better, and patience. Patience beyond what we have historically ever seen in the past. We have to challenge ourselves to move outside of our comfort zone and seek these partnerships that we never thought were possible in the past. Because frankly, climate change is going to challenge us in the future in ways that we never thought was also possible in the past. So we need to meet that challenge with our own innovative ideas and partnerships and willingness to move beyond the combat discussions to how do we all get better together.
Ali, it's really nice to hear you on this kind of optimistic view about this issue, because it looks like really complicated, and we know that it's a tough work. So it's great to hear you in that optimistic view. So I was thinking also that we all know that climate change impacts, and Karla was mentioning some of that, climate change impacts are not burdened by all communities equally. So we know problems of dry wells in the San Joaquin Valley, especially, but also in other communities. We know the problems of water quality issues, and also flood risks might be also higher in underserved communities. So I was especially thinking about Karla and team. What equity considerations should we account for when planning for new infrastructure investments? So Karla, would you take a first shot of that?
Sure. So this question is really important, and I want to pick up on something that I think Tim and both Daniel mentioned early on, which is, we've got aging infrastructure that needs reinvestment. We also need to do historic reinvestment from a water supply perspective, new kinds of water supply, desalination, stormwater, these sorts of things. But when I think of some of the reinvestment in aging infrastructure, a lot of it was the first half of the last century, or if you're flood, you go back even further. And California was such a different place. We had about half the population. We didn't have the environmental laws we have in place now. And, partly because, our environmental conditions were better, but we've seen population go up, our ecosystems are in decline, but also behind that, we've also seen this, broadening inequity throughout society. So we have a much sort of deeper problem when we think about how do we invest and do it in a way that brings in economically disadvantaged communities, when we know that some of the things that we're doing are certainly going to strain a lot of ratepayers or all these kinds of fee-based systems. So I do think we need on the flood side. One of the things that passed out of the legislature this year, which I think is interesting moving forward, and my hope is with the Biden administration and the Army Corps of Engineers, the department and the flood board can get into a conversation about how we fund things. So there was a bill that came out that was focused on a low-income community in Santa Cruz, Monterey area, Pajaro community that really struggled to come up with a local match for really critical flood protection. We've spent a lot of time in the last drought starting to understand more about the vulnerability of drought for these kinds of communities, but same true for flood, low-income communities and flood protection. So we do need to rethink what it means to establish a state, local, federal partnership to get these public safety projects going. And that's absolutely going to be a state federal partnership. And I really appreciate Tim's comments about state agencies need to talk better to each other. There's probably things that we need to be doing together with our insurance commissioner's office. They have a climate and sustainability office, and really thinking about flood protection and how even our insurance programs are structured to work better for disadvantaged communities and these low-income communities. When it comes to drought, I think these bigger projects need to work better. And so, one case in point, I think that is also interesting in this drought is because of the advances, albeit not as fast as people would like to see relative to groundwater management. But, for the State Water Project, for example, for this year, we really do understand better the way in which a lack of surface water supplies is going to show up in certain parts of the Central Valley relative to strain on domestic wells. So we finally have some information that we can start to piece all together and really understand that when how we prioritize our state water project deliveries in this kind of a year really matters on the ground to communities. And there is a follow-on effect that we now need to start taking into consideration. So this year coming up, we're really focused on human health and safety numbers for state water contractors. We are looking for to make sure that some communities that have a proximity to state and federal infrastructure projects have access in these emergency kinds of circumstances to surface water. And those are the kinds of things we need to be doing when we think about infrastructure improvements and thinking about how we manage that infrastructure. So it's a very rich topic that is going to require a lot of careful, not just consideration, but extended engagement and communication more broadly. And that's going to be something that we're going to do better if all of our state agencies are working a little bit more hand in glove when we're reaching out to these kinds of communities and designing our programs.
Thanks, Karla. I just wanted also to ask Tim, because we had a planning conversation about that. So and also on your previous question, on your previous answer, you mentioned the things on the federal government and the kind of a little bit on the rules of investments. So what could you bring to this discussion?
Right. No, thank you for that. Karla's description reminded me of a story out in Hamilton City, which about 20 years ago, the state very creatively navigated the existing rules to provide the non-federal share in an area where they otherwise wouldn't be able to have afforded it. But we did that by being creative. And I think it doesn't always work. And sometimes we should probably think about how we change the rules. And the federal rules are harder to change, obviously. So if the state needs to figure out a way to do it ourselves, I think maybe we should. And again, I'm focused on the San Joaquin side in particular. It's really a place where the state and federal government have built projects to move water through the valley, and probably not thought very much about the people that live there, and really think about how these rivers need to be community assets. The people that live there need to have places to go, to recreate. They need food. Rivers provide all of those things, right? The Merced and the Tuolumne River are part of Yosemite National Park. Everybody drives to Yosemite when they can, if they have a car, to go to the park. Those same rivers into the San Joaquin River downstream in the valley, and there's not a lot there for people to make use of those river assets, and in particular for the people that live there. And they shouldn't have to get in their car and drive to the High Sierra to see those same river systems. So I think it's really critical for us to not just find a way to move water around where it needs to go with the system that we built 100 years ago, but think about the people that live there now and how our investments are going to really affect them and create open spaces and opportunities and really make them assets for those local communities. And we can do that because as the state, and especially as the board, these investments are statewide. They really contribute not just to the people that live there, but we can think about the benefits that all Californians would receive by making those improvements in those communities.
Thanks so much, Tim. So let's, in terms of wrapping up this conversation, I would like to highlight that tomorrow our second panel is going to talk about how to pay for water system resilience while keeping water services affordable. So I would like to go with each of you with one final lightning round question. And the question is, what's your number one priority on infrastructure investment? So let's start with Daniel, and I will go with each of the panelists.
I would say both physical and natural infrastructure that can help us co-manage flood and drought risk while providing other societal and environmental benefits along the way. Sometimes it sounds too good to be true when you have win-win or win-win-win kinds of proposals, but this probably really is one of those. It would cost money and it would require changing rules and putting into place new policies. But if we, those are all things that can be done. Money exists, and political will can be changed. So I think that if there's one track towards engaging in interventions that are really going to match what the physical reality of the world we live in now and will be living in a few decades looks like, broadly speaking, projects that are flexible and that have multi-benefits and encompass both flood and drought hazards and benefits, since there are some benefits to floods, they are probably the way to go.
Thanks. That makes a lot of sense. So, Ali, what's your number one priority?
Well, I have to follow Daniel, because I was about to say, I don't know how I can say it better than Daniel did. These multi-benefit projects that we're really, as Karla and others talked about, we're planning for droughts in our flood times, and we're planning for flood in our drought times. it's water does have an important value in our river systems and in our floodplains. It adds a tremendous ecosystem value, but also groundwater recharge values. And I look at these multi-benefit projects and think they are hard. I think, Daniel, that we can do them with some of our current political will. Some might change some of the political framework, but we can get there with a lot of them. And I see that those are the future for our investments.
Thanks, Ali. Tim, what's your number one priority investment?
I'm going to say what I said before, I think, but my number one investment priority is to make what we have already, our green infrastructure, make the rivers bigger and make them accessible for the people that live there and give them opportunities to enjoy those open spaces. I grew up in Southern California, and I didn't know where the rivers were when I was growing up because they were behind fences and behind homes. They were built to be hidden and to convey water and for people not to make use of those spaces. And if the San Joaquin Valley looks like that in 20 years, then we'll have missed an opportunity.
Thanks, Tim. That's a really great point. And Karla, you have the last word of the discussion. So what's your number one priority investment?
Number one infrastructure investment in a state that manages everything at the local level so intensely. I just, would agree with Ali that I can't really say it any better than Daniel did, that real integration of flood and getting that groundwater recharge going in California. I think really no matter where you are in California is going to be one of the single most important investments we can make in terms of readiness. I'll end there.
Thanks, Karla. So thank you so much for this discussion. Thanks to all of our panelists. Has been really interesting and really great points have been made. I would like just to send our apologies to our audience. We couldn't do our live broadcast, but at least we did this session. We recorded the session, and we are pretty sure that you'll enjoy it as we have done. So thanks for attending this event. I also would like to thank all the awesome PPIC staff that has worked behind the scenes. And then remember to tune in again tomorrow, Tuesday at 11 a.m. for our second panel discussion. So have a great rest of your day. Thanks so much.